14th June 1985, on the morning of everything at Athens Airport was completely normal. People were rushing to catch their flights, some were drinking coffee, some were saying goodbye to their families, and no one had any idea that within a few hours this very flight would turn into one of the world's most dangerous hostage crises. Trans World Airlines. Flight 847 had already arrived in Athens from Cairo, and its next journey was to Rome, then Boston, and finally Los Angeles. There were 153 people on board the plane, a large number of them American passengers. But among those very passengers sat two men who carried more than just tickets. They carried weapons, grenades, and a mission that would force the entire world to watch for the next 17 days. And their goal wasn't simply to hijack the plane. They wanted Israeli prisons to release the prisoners held there, in exchange for the American citizens in their custody. About 20 minutes after takeoff, the plane was at 28,000 feet. The passengers felt they were on an ordinary flight. Then suddenly, commotion broke out in the rear cabin. Flight attendant Uli Derrickson pulled back the curtain to try to see what was happening. In the next moment, a man rushed toward her and kicked her hard, knocking her to the ground. Before she could recover, she was dragged toward the cockpit. Behind him was a second man, carrying a pistol and a grenade. The cockpit door opened, and within seconds, the pilots were overpowered at gunpoint. The captain was given a direct order: change the plane's course. The destination was Beirut, Lebanon. Now the lives of 153 passengers depended on the decisions of two armed men. The captain knew that landing in Beirut was extremely dangerous. The runway at the airport had been blocked to prevent the plane from landing. But the hijackers made it clear that if they were stopped from going to Beirut, the passengers' lives would be in danger. They had a grenade, they had guns, and their biggest weapon was 153 innocent people. Eventually, the plane reached Beirut. As soon as it landed on the runway, the hijackers laid out their demands. They wanted fuel, they wanted food, and most importantly, they wanted negotiations for the release of prisoners. But the authorities at Beirut Airport did not immediately agree to their demands. They believed that if they gave the plane fuel, the hijackers would simply fly off again and the crisis would grow even bigger. This is where the hijacking began to take a new form. The hijackers began seating the passengers separately. American passengers began to be identified. Every passport was no longer just an identity. It had become a decision of life and death for someone. Flight attendant Uli Derrickson showed extraordinary courage throughout this time. She knew that if she directly opposed the hijackers, the situation could get worse. So she kept talking with them. Sometimes she gave them food, sometimes tea, and sometimes she spoke to them in German. Gradually, she began to understand that her staying calm had become a thin wall of safety for the passengers. She first asked for women and children to be released. The hijackers refused. She then spoke up for elderly women and children. Again, the answer was no, but she did not give up. Eventually, some elderly women and children were allowed to leave the plane. But with every passing minute on the ground, the hijackers grew more and more restless. They feared that America might launch some kind of commando operation. So they began targeting the American military personnel among the passengers. Some of them were American Navy divers. They were taken near the cockpit and beaten badly. On the radio, Captain Rick kept warning the airport authorities that if fuel was not provided, passengers' lives could be lost. Eventually, the plane was refueled, and the hijackers decided to leave Beirut. But now the question was, where would they go? The next destination became Algeria. The hijackers hoped that they would be safe there and could take their demands to the international stage. When the plane reached Algeria, another round began. Negotiations, demands, fuel, and the release of passengers. Then, for several hours, a passenger, referred to as Carlson, was beaten. Captain Rick kept pleading on the radio for help and fuel. The situation grew so tense that flight attendant Derrickson herself had to step in. She told the hijackers not to kill this man. But not every time did her efforts succeed. Then came a moment that shook the entire world. American Navy diver Robert Stetham was taken off the plane by the hijackers and shot. His body lay on the runway. The remaining passengers inside the plane understood that these men were no longer just making threats. They could truly kill someone. After this, the crisis grew even more severe. The hijackers ordered the plane to be taken back to Beirut. Along the way, Stetham's fellow servicemen were threatened and beaten. But the most remarkable thing about Stetham was that even as he was being beaten, he refused to scream. The hijackers wanted his screams to reach the other passengers so that fear would spread among them. But he did not give them that satisfaction. When the plane began approaching Beirut for the second time, the airport authorities again tried to stop the landing. The runway lights were switched off. Captain Test Rick warned that the plane's fuel was running out and that if landing wasn't permitted, there could be a crash. A few seconds later, the hijackers themselves took over the radio. Their message was direct: if we are not allowed to land, we will crash the plane. Finally, the runway lights came back on. Flight 847 had landed in Beirut for the second time. But now this was no longer just an operation run by two hijackers. On the ground, various militias and political organizations began getting involved in the crisis. For groups like Hezbollah and the Amal movement, this matter carried both political and religious significance. The hijackers now began receiving local support and protection. In the darkness of night, armed men reached the plane. Some came aboard, and some passengers were taken to separate locations. The American passengers were hidden in different places to make any possible rescue operation extremely difficult. Now America's biggest problem was this: it knew where the hostages were not, but it was very difficult to find out where they actually were. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting on the American president. America's policy was clear: no negotiating with terrorists. But this was no ordinary political crisis. Here, American citizens were at gunpoint. Reagan kept saying publicly that America would not bow before terrorists. But behind the scenes, negotiations were underway. For several days, the world kept waiting. Sometimes a hostage would be brought in front of the camera. Sometimes someone would be released. Sometimes a new demand would emerge. Every new day brought the same question: whose life would be in danger next? After several rounds of negotiation, a path toward a possible agreement finally opened. Israel took steps toward releasing some Lebanese prisoners. But the demand was much bigger than that. They wanted the release of hundreds of prisoners. Days went by. First, a few people were released, then a few more. But 39 Americans were still in captivity. For 17 days, the world watched this story unfold. For 17 days, families waited for news of their loved ones. For 17 days, pressure kept mounting on the American government. Finally, around June 30th, the agreement everyone had been waiting for came through. The path to the hostages' release became clear. One by one, the 39 remaining American hostages were brought out from different locations. They were taken from Beirut to Syria, and preparations were made to send them back to America from there. When they finally returned to their country, their faces showed more exhaustion than joy. For some, this was the end of 17 days. But for many, this fear would last a lifetime. Robert Stetham did not return. His death made this entire event something far bigger than just a hijacking. He had become the most painful face of this crisis. Reagan later said that America would not forget him and that his killers would be brought to justice. But the story did not end there. The hijackers disappeared in Beirut. For years, they remained hidden in different places. Some were later found connected to other hijacking cases. Mohammed Ali Hamadi was arrested years later in Germany. Serious charges were brought against him, and he received a long sentence. But many years later, he was released and returned to Lebanon. A flight that could have reached Los Angeles in a matter of hours instead turned into a moving prison for 17 days. 153 people were caught in the middle of a conflict whose outcome was not in their hands. For them, politics meant nothing more than someone standing before them with a gun. For them, war meant nothing more than the fact that returning home was no longer certain. And for them, every hour of those 17 days carried just one question: will we make it home alive? TWA Flight 847 was not just a hijacking in aviation history. It was such a mixture of the politics, terrorism, international pressure, and human fear of that era that it showed the world how a few people sitting inside a plane could challenge even the biggest governments. If you liked the video, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel.